Welcome to our Climate Chatter on Sustainable Finance, where we will be talking about how you can implement your climate commitment. My name is Ramona Bettler. I'm the events manager at Southpaw, and I will be your host for today. I'm very excited to be joined by our experts from HSBC, the World Bank, and Amalgamated Bank. So this is our second webinar during this virtual Climate Week. And while we would have loved to see you all in person in New York, going virtual allows us to come together from all over the world in a bigger number while still keeping our carbon footprint low. So we hope this makes for an even more interesting and diverse conversation. So before we jump right into the topic, a few housekeeping rules. So we know that sustainable finance is one of the hottest topics in the climate space, and we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. As attendees, you're currently all on mute, but if you do have a comment, a question, please let us know through the question function on your control panel. And if you have technical difficulties, please let us know. For questions related to the presentations, we'd like to refer you to the Q&A at the end of the webinar. This webinar will also be recorded and sent to you within the next week. And last but not least, we're all broadcasting from our homes, so please bear with us in case there are any technical hiccups. So for those who don't know yet, Southpaw is a leading project developer and a globally recognized advisor on climate action. So we've been in the business of fighting climate change and developing result-based climate solutions from the get-go since our founding in 2006. Today, we have our boots on the ground in 18 global offices, and our team of over 300 experts is working side by side with companies, investors, and the public sector to help them create value on their climate journey. In the sustainable finance space, we provide environmental data-led advisory services to banks, asset managers, private equity, asset owners, and pension schemes across the world. And with these words, I'd like to hand over to Rebecca Self, who is our Director of Sustainable Finance. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramona, and hello everyone today. By way of introduction, my name is Rebecca. I'm the Director of Sustainable Finance at Southpaw, and by background, I have 20 years experience in the banking industry, and I'm a chartered accountant, and I've studied for a master's in sustainability leadership at the University of Cambridge. First, a few opening words, and then we'll have an intro to each of our fantastic panelists today. We'll hear from them in turn, and then have the Q&A, and then some closing words before we finish at around 1:15. So starting with the opening words. Well, actually, maybe we'll start with the intros first. So maybe turning to the panelists for some short introductions. Neha, please could you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Neha Mukhi, Senior Specialist Energy and Climate Change with the World Bank. And I've been working in the bank with the Climate Change Group, leading our internal initiative on the World Bank Outlook 2050 that looks at how the World Bank can support countries in meeting decarbonization goals. Other than that, I also work with the energy sector practice, working with the Latin American Caribbean region on renewable energy, clean energy, and resilient solutions, and in South Asia.
Thank you very much. And Jen, please could you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Apologies, my video is not working. I'm one of these people who's remote and having technical difficulties. My name is Jennifer Livingstone, and I work in sustainable finance at HSBC. I'm responsible for the bank's ESG external disclosures, ESG investor relations activity, and involved in our plans of integrating ESG more broadly within our business strategy and reporting. I've also been very close to our TCFD disclosure, which is what I'll be talking about today.
Lovely, thank you. And last but not least, Ivan.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be with everybody today. My name's Ivan Frishberg. I'm the Director of Impact Policy at Amalgamated Bank. I work within the commercial banking division of the bank and also with our CSR committee. And particularly, I lead a lot of our climate climate policy initiatives, as well as our shareholder engagement work and many other things. Wear many hats here at the bank.
Great, thank you. And then a few words by context, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists in more detail. So the global financial system facilitates trade. It's a mechanism for pooling resources, manages risks and set prices. And it's been around since the late 19th century. And there are around 25,000 banks globally of varying different sizes. About 7,000 of those are based in the United States. And these organizations shape our lives, our society. We probably interact with them in some form or another on a daily basis. And they're a really powerful mechanism to encourage positive impacts for our society, for our planet, for people. And there are outcomes that as a planet we're looking to achieve. For instance, the Paris Agreement goal of achieving between 1.5 or 2 degrees, or limiting, I should say, warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, and also managing our resources as a planet better and in a more sustainable way. These banks and financial organizations are facing a huge number of initiatives. There's TCFD, ESG initiatives, SASB, science-based targets, PCAF, just to name just a few. So how are these organizations going about doing this, and what are some of the challenges they're facing, and how can we overcome some of those challenges? And with that, I'll turn to our first panelist for a few words and an introduction. And I understand there's an exciting report that will be available soon or is already available, and that's Neha. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks for that context setting as well. So World Bank, as you know, is an international organization that works with countries, with governments on with the twin goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity with all our client countries. And what we've come to accept and understand is that climate change actually poses a huge risks for our institution meeting the goals and the global goals that we have been working towards. In fact, climate change and sustainable development are quite interlinked. And in the recent years, globally, there has been progress across countries, across sectors towards climate action. However, the scale and pace of action that we're seeing is not enough to meet the goals that you just highlighted for the Paris Agreement to maintain, to limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. This could largely be attributed perhaps to a few reasons. One being how climate change has been considered as an incremental issue across sectors, as opposed to a systemic risk to economies that shapes the way how we've been developing our solutions to address this challenge. Secondly, the financing needs to meet the goals, the climate goals, are quite large. They're already quite large to meet the development goals that countries are working towards. On top of that, if we are to achieve this in a climate-friendly, sustainable way, the financing needs are quite huge. Now, with these sort of considerations in mind, the World Bank had launched its initiative last year on the Outlook 2050, looking at how we can support countries in meeting the goals of decarbonization and development. Now, what came out, what emerged as one of the key messages as of this work, the report was released earlier in June this year, and the main message that emerged from this that in order to achieve transformative climate action, we need to be looking at a two-level approach. A bottom-up approach with actions across sectors, cross-sectoral actions that address climate-friendly investments, that bring about climate-friendly investments in energy systems, food systems, mobility, urban systems, water and digital, and so on, which need to be looked at through a systems approach, accounting for interconnections across components in the economy, and also if planned well, they can deliver not just mitigation, but adaptation co-benefits as well. This bottom-up approach needs to be complemented by a top-down approach that brings about integration of long-term climate objectives in macroeconomic frameworks, in national budgets and expenditure frameworks, in our financial sector policy and incentives to incentivize action, and overall a systems approach to economy-wide planning. Now, the second part, the top-down approach of economy-wide actions that I mentioned right now, has been where the action has not been at par with what we've seen across sectors. So, ministries of finance or central planning agencies or the financial sectors are now becoming increasingly active in this space to support climate action. So that's sort of the report identifies key actions across these areas and highlights how the bank can also support countries in creating an enabling environment through policies, through incentives to attract and crowd in private sector finance. As I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges we face with climate change is the large amounts of financing that's needed. And given the limited sources of resources with public financing, with development financing, this gap will need to be filled through private sector investments, and that's the core messages of the report. How we can support countries in creating an enabling environment to bring about private sector action, and specifically focusing on the financial sector and the industry here, based on the experience that has been emerging. What we saw that it became very clear that there are several reasons where action has not been as fast, and one of those was the lack of tools available for the financial industry to assess these risks on their investments, to inform investment decision making. We're now seeing a range of tools with respect to carbon accounting for financed emissions, or with respect to tools that support the development of strategies, all in all to sort of put together a more sort of cross-sectoral, economy-wide approach that looks at a long term, because climate change is a problem that manifests itself over a longer horizon. We're already starting to see some of these impacts, but it has a long-term horizon which needs to be accounted for.
Thank you, really interesting. And I think that point on the long term is really relevant in this context, and bringing that long-term view into the systems and the tools that we use today. Thank you. And now moving to the private sector and the largest bank in Europe, or one of. And Jen, you've been a practitioner in this area for a few years. Could you share some views of how you found getting started in this area in a large global bank?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Happy to share. I'm going to focus on TCFD and our learnings and experience through setting up our TCFD disclosures as an example, but I think that some of the things I'm going to be speaking to would apply to any commitments that would be made by a financial institution or a large organization looking at ESG or climate. So HSBC was one of the initial signatories to TCFD, and we did our first disclosure in 2017. So that means that in our upcoming 2020 annual report, we will have our fourth disclosure. We have learned a lot, and I would say that we're continuing to learn from this journey. And I don't think that will stop at the 5-year mark either. I think it'll be an ongoing journey. So I've broken down the learnings or pieces of advice into 3 different buckets. So the first one is around when you're starting your TCFD journey or starting to think about these kinds of commitments, is to do your groundwork. So the entire process will be a lot easier if you can set up the internal engagement and support that you need within the organization. So think about who are the champions in your organization, who are the decision makers that you need to get on board, and how do you bring them around in your organization. And in a large global organization, that might not be the people that you would think of, right, coming to mind. So it's important to have those conversations and be thoughtful in that. As part of the groundwork, and it's interesting, before the panel started, we were talking about this a little bit, is that it's important to get agreement on how your organization wants to be positioned in the space and how this fits into your wider strategy and purpose. So it's really beneficial if that you're driving your narrative and not letting a disclosure drive your strategy. So try and think about it that way around. For HSBC, I think this is something that was a little bit clear, or we came into pretty clearly, which was helpful. In 2017, we'd set the ambition to be a leading global partner in the financing, managing, and shaping of the transition to a low carbon world. So we sort of recognized that our place was not going to be the super green financial institution, that we were going to be the ones who are able to partner with our clients and help them with their transition. And that helped us when we're formulating our TCFD disclosure and our strategy and how we wanted to articulate our place in this space. So that's do your groundwork. And my second piece of advice is around operational considerations. And I know this one sounds so boring, but I would say it's just such an important piece that I couldn't not speak to it. If you think about TCFD, it's set up across 4 pillars. And beneath that, there are 11 recommendations. So it can feel pretty overwhelming. And when you think about that within a 5-year plan, think, oh, there's lots of time to figure things out along the way and bumble along. But trust me, 5 years will come around really quickly. So what I'd say is start with the low-hanging fruit. So most well-run organizations are probably already doing some of the elements of TCFD and those recommendations already. It's just about disclosing them. So for instance, your resilience risk team might already have information about the physical risk of your operations and be doing that piece of work. And it's just about connecting those dots across your organization. Our HSBC year 1 disclosure was a single page in our annual report, and it was very qualitative in nature. But what I will say is it felt really good to get the ball rolling, to put something out there and get started. The next bit of this is where the detailed planning comes in. And early on, if you can set out a roadmap across the 5 years and think about your gap analysis, resource asks, data needs, which data is such a big component of this, and then start socializing what that looks like so that there aren't surprises along the way and you can start to get the buy-in into what's needed. So once you have your roadmap and your critical path are in place and you know what your asks are, it'll be a lot easier to start socializing and keep the momentum over the years ahead. So the first learning is the groundwork. Second is these operational considerations. And the third learning I would say is around engagement. What I found and has been really surprising. So before I joined sustainable finance, I've been in the finance function for my whole career, is that there's such a wide network in this space that you aren't alone. Nobody has all of the answers, but there are so many great resources through industry groups, membership associations, bilateral conversations with peers, and that has been such an invaluable network to continuing this journey and for learning across the way, and it makes it much less daunting. So if I was going to give a report card about how HSBC has done in this, I'd say we've done really well on the buy-in and knowing how we wanted to position ourselves and our engagement externally. I think we could have done better. Looking here at our year 4 disclosure, we could have done a little bit better upfront in our detailed planning and resource asks. That's something I think we could have done differently. But like I said, I don't see year 5 as the end of this journey. Back over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts. And I think I'll certainly take away, do your groundwork, think about the operational project management expertise that's needed, including stakeholder management, and just recognize these disclosures. They will expand, they will evolve over time, so it's not static. So thank you very much. And then Ivan, switching to more of a US context, and then also the role that you have with the PCAF initiative as well, which is gaining huge ground and a really important initiative in this context. Great to get some of your initial thoughts. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to team at Southpaw. We've worked with you for a number of years on our sustainability program, so I'm a huge fan of your work. And I would just say, Jennifer, to sort of plug another thing I'm involved with, the Climate Safe Learning Lab. That case study, I think, was a really good one. And I would encourage you to check out the Climate Safe Learning Lab, which is a network of bank sustainability folks sort of working together as a peer group, because I think that would be a great learning to share. So Rebecca, as you mentioned, in addition to being at Amalgamated Bank, I am on the steering committee and helped lead the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. It's an industry-led effort to develop a harmonized and standardized system for measuring financed emissions across both asset owners, asset managers, and of course the banking sector. The real drive has come for this because in all of the many things we have to do as financial institutions, thinking through risk, target setting, strategic plans and taking action, disclosure and responsiveness to stakeholders. When it comes to climate, understanding the basic analysis of financed emissions and that data set is just a really sort of foundational piece. But if everybody kind of picks their own adventure for how you get there, then it doesn't really help both institutions and the sector as a whole. So the drive from industry has been to make sure that there is a standard, harmonized, and transparent way to measure and disclose financed emissions. And later this fall, we'll publish the kind of the global standard and have the greenhouse gas protocol stamp of approval. And it is really very much based on the work that was done in North America and the Netherlands for many years. The thing I want to sort of speak to about the standard is sort of the relationship to Climate Week and to where we're going over the next year with the COP is really to put it in the context of the net zero ambition that I think is swirling around every institution right now, both in the financial sector and the corporates. And it's we were very excited to see this week Morgan Stanley, also on the steering committee of PCAF, come out with the net zero ambition. I just, I sort of noted the response from some of the NGO, the advocacy groups, the sorts of folks who are publishing the Banking on Climate report. And the question is, okay, a 2050 ambition target is a nice thing, but it really only means something to the extent that it's supported by real infrastructure, which can be defined as interim targets or specific sector-based plans for high carbon parts of the economy or fossil fuels, working through things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But once you look beneath that target, it's really the infrastructure of the organizations that starts to make those targets real. And that is very much where we sort of saw PCAF playing an important role, which is fundamentally, if you have a system across asset classes for a full portfolio where you can measure financed emissions, there's clear, consistent rules across the industry for disclosure. And if we can make sure that it fits with the TCFD guidelines, the data that's being developed is usable in the context of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has their final guidance for validating science-based targets coming out, I think, October 1st. And on the disclosure side, we've worked very hard to make sure that it is complementary and fits in with the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP's new reporting standard for financial institutions. So the interconnectedness of all those initiatives and having a financed emissions methodology that fits with everything and supports everything else that the bank is working to do was really important. And as you mentioned, it's been growing. When we launched this day a year ago in a hot, stuffy room in New York, and that took a lot of carbon to get there. And we had about $3 trillion in assets. We now have over $13 trillion of assets. Last week, the UK launched a working group on PCAF led by Federated Hermes and Lloyd's, along with NatWest and a bunch of others. So we really are growing significantly and becoming a sort of, I think, a foundational part of the whole climate finance ecosystem. So we're excited about being able to, from an industry perspective, deliver that to the world at large and to our peers. And thank you for the opportunity to come here and talk about it.
Yeah, no problem. Well, appreciate you taking the time as well. And maybe a few thoughts to sum up some of what we've heard so far and give time in case people have questions. And please do put them into the questions area in your control panel. So scale and pace is what's needed here, and some of the gap that we faced so far. So really important to get started. And I think Jen gave some really good examples of how to get started from an institutional perspective. Deciding on your own ambition level being important and getting that groundwork in place. And Ivan, thank you for summing up PCAF and that initiative and science-based targets and also net zero. Lots of different initiatives out there, but PCAF being a really important one, and the methodology behind how to look at the carbon emissions associated with lending and investment within a bank, within the wider financial industry. So thank you for summing that up. And there are a number of initiatives that will continue to see science-based targets being one of them, which is due to come out soon. So I'll pause just to see if there are any questions and take a look. And if not, I'll start with maybe some of my own. And Neha, the first one. As you were talking, you mentioned some of the interconnectedness between climate change and social issues as well, and the importance of looking at the system as a whole. And I wondered if perhaps you could give an example there or just expand on that systems thinking piece a little bit. It was relatively new for me when I came across systems thinking while studying for my master's. So yeah, it'd be useful to share some more about that. Thank you.
Sure, happy to. And thanks, Rebecca. This topic of systems thinking, it's not new. It's like you said, it's been around, and there's been a lot of work in trying to see how we can incorporate this in our work on, especially like from the World Bank's perspective in terms of our investments, in terms of our support to countries. Because when we are typically involved in a country, we're looking at across sectors. We're looking across infrastructure, natural resources sectors. We're looking at how to support the finance and planning agencies. And when we're looking at a more sort of focused, siloed sectoral approach, it's easy to miss out on trade-offs across sectors that we might be making. For example, energy is an area that I work in, and hydropower or even other types of renewable energy like solar and wind. They have their own sort of natural resource requirements. So while the country might be rich in certain renewable energy resources, the associated resource requirements for these investments, if not well accounted for example, in the case of hydropower, water vulnerability and availability, seasonal variability or variability with climate, if that's not accounted for, then we're missing out on what might happen to that investment over time. So accounting for climate change in a sort of integrated way of how the linked resources through an integrated resource framework, if that's not accounted for, then that's a challenge. Similarly, so this is from an infrastructure and resource interconnection, but there's also, if we're looking to attract private sector investments in the energy sector and renewable energy investments, but the incentives and the policy framework is not conducive to that environment, then we often, we could end up having pilot investments that are not scaled up to the level of market engagement that we would like it to be, and the sector then continues to rely on public resources that, for countries that already are working with scarce resources in tight fiscal space environment with competing demands from multiple sectors. So that's kind of the approach that we are bringing in, whether it is investments in particular sectors or supporting central agencies, looking at the cross-economy impacts of specific actions and strategies that are adopted.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting summary. And one of the initiatives I've come across in the UK or areas of work is a just transition, which I mentioned before. So looking at the transition toward a low carbon economy and fossil fuel industries in that context. And then what happens as a result of climate action, which could have social consequences, and considering fully the system. So not looking at some of these issues in a silo, but looking across the E, the environment, the G, and also the S, the social, and those interconnections is really important. And with that in mind, Ivan, perhaps I'll turn to you and thinking about the energy context and perhaps where you're based in the US. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts there about that context that you operate within.
Yep. I mean, you mentioned just transition. We were, for some additional context, we're a 100-year-old institution, and we were actually started by a labor union in New York City. And so many of our clients over the most of our history really do come from the labor movement, and we've expanded out now as sort of a socially responsible bank with a much broader client portfolio of including B Corp businesses, philanthropies, nonprofit groups, even political campaigns. But that just transition and that integration of sustainability and social particularly are sort of so central to the way that we look at things, and has been central to the political debate about clean energy and climate action here. You have to do this stuff right, and you have to think about the transition that happens. I think too often, though, there's a rather simplistic notion that you just take a steelworker job or a coal miner job and you turn it into a clean energy job that's going to work in solar. So, and that there's sort of in the same way we might just say, okay, we're going to take the balance sheet of a bank that's invested in oil and gas and sort of just move it over to clean energy. It's more complicated than that. Those things don't translate in a, if it's not this, then it's that sort of way. And so at the same time, we are, I mean, candidly, we're obviously way, way behind in building the clean energy economy that we need, and have sort of, as Mark Carney calls it, we have a kind of a missed decade or a wasted decade that we've just sort of seen, and we're not making the kind of progress that science has asked of us. At the same time, we need to sort of really double down and invest in kind of local economies that work for working people, that work for equity to be shared and prosperity to be shared. That is, again, it's no mistake that we're as we're slipping in our progress on climate goals, we're also slipping in sort of most social equity indexes. And so I think rather than putting the burden on one thing to be perfect, and the idea is we should be doing all of these things very aggressively and simultaneously to build an economy that really does work for people and planet. So that's I think it's a critical topic and one that's very kind of near and dear to our history and the focus of our bankers.
Yeah, thank you. And I couldn't agree more about getting the economy that really works for people and the planet. That objective, ambitious but really important. Maybe switching tack a little bit, we've had a few questions come in around reporting standards and these various different initiatives, which help, of course, with these overall ambitions that we have. And there are a number of different initiatives, for instance, SASB, TCFD, and CDP, which I mentioned. So Jen, one of the questions has been, which of those do you consider to be the most important? And perhaps I'll give my own response initially. And I generally think with TCFD is very similar to CDP, so it enables you to really answer both those two questions. But ESG and SASB is certainly broader. It focuses on the E, also those other components, bringing in the social dimension. But there are a huge number of different standards. There was another set released yesterday from the World Economic Forum, supported by the Big Four. And from my perspective, it might be a bit simplistic, but I usually think it's best to just pick some and do them really well, and not try to do everything, because you simply won't have time and capacity to do that. But with that being said, Jen, interested to get your view perhaps on the standards, TCFD, CDP, those that you used, and then also any thoughts, if you have them, on the new standards which have just been released.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I would echo your thoughts about TCFD being a very important one. So at HSBC, we disclose against TCFD and we do our annual CDP disclosure as well. At present, we actually are not disclosing against any of the other standards. And the reason really has been that there was so little consistency and we could spend all of our time just disclosing numbers to fit every box and every different set of standards that are out there, and it wasn't something that was getting a lot of demand from investors or from our stakeholders to do it. So we thought, let's disclose the information we think is material as an organization and just put that out there. Now, what I would say is that over the past, I would say 4 months, there's been a lot of momentum around creating more standardized non-financial metrics. So in the European context, the European Commission just recently completed a consultation for the non-financial reporting directive. So they will be looking in Europe at setting a set of standard non-financial metrics that all companies would be disclosing against. So yet to see what will come out of that. But a lot of the initial responses and what HSBC certainly advocated for was alignment to a subset of the existing standards and frameworks, TCFD, and then picking the most relevant or material metrics across these various frameworks. So that's happening on the European front. And then almost in parallel, the WEF proposed metrics came out. And then I think it was 1 or 2 weeks ago, GRI, SASB, IIRC, CDSB all came out with a statement of collaboration as well. So I think we're getting to a point where there will start to be a little bit more convergence in the market, and that's a very welcome thing. And I would say both from a corporate that's trying to do the reporting to have something that's a little bit more straightforward to report against, but then also from an investor perspective of having a consistent set of metrics that they'll be able to compare across companies.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Ivan, perhaps a similar question to you. Do you have a view on all of these various different standards? Which ones do you use? Which do you consider the most important? And perhaps if you could add any regional context there.
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is that they're not all just things that you can kind of pick and choose from, that they, for the most part, they serve different purposes. You know, TCFD is a framework for approaching risk that is mostly internal to the financial institution itself or to the corporate itself. And these other initiatives are different. So CDP, you can follow the TCFD recommendation and assess your greenhouse gas emissions. If you're a corporate or a financial or an energy company, you can do that. When it comes to CDP, that's where you sort of leave that body of information. You don't report it to TCFD. You want to put it in the hands of investors and stakeholders. And the most organized way to do that is through CDP. Once you get to target setting and you're doing something like SBTI, then everybody wants to work to a common framework for doing that, corporates and financials both. The trick is to make those things connect with each other, I believe. So we're orders of magnitude smaller than HSBC as an institution. And so if we're going to do something like measuring our financed emissions, we can do it one way to disclose it. But if we have to then redo all our math and our data analysis to produce the disclosure that we do for CDP, and then we need something different for when we get into the target setting process and how we figure out to align to the various decarbonization pathways, then it becomes really overwhelming and cost prohibitive, right? And so the idea of having alignment between the frameworks and common data products and sort of end results that we can use in different instances, I think is the real key. And I completely agree with Jennifer. That kind of harmonization and standardization is really happening now in a very aggressive way, because I think for years, it's been the kind of common refrain of, well, we don't know what to do. There's this, there's that. There's so many to pick from. And it's so, and I think we're getting to the point where it's like, okay, we have to take all of those sorts of issues off the table and just get the job done. And so I think that's what's driving a lot of this collaboration.
Thank you. And yeah, that collaboration and alignment is really good to see and really encouraging. We had a final question I'll respond to, which is around training in this area. Perhaps I'll turn to each of the panelists very, very briefly. That if there's particular training courses or ways that you've educated yourself on sustainable finance, and this is being asked by someone who's a finance professional, but they're looking to move into the sustainable finance area. And for me personally, I studied with the Cambridge Centre for Sustainability Leadership, CISL. And they have a great online course and other programs. There's also a free sustainable finance course run by the University of Rotterdam, which is the MOC, Sustainable Finance, and you can Google that. But there's quite a number of other courses, GARP, the risk professionals being another one, where there's an extensive course on climate risk. But maybe I'll very briefly turn to the other panelists, see if there's other training or ways that they have found to educate themselves in this area. Neha.
Sure, happy to. So something that that is available through the World Bank's open Courseware are some fundamental courses on integrating climate change into investment decision making and broadly sustainable finance. And there are also some sort of foundational courses on what kind of data needs are, what are the data needs associated with thinking about investment decision making with respect to investment. So climate risk related data or policy related data. So there are some open courses through the World Bank platform.
Great, thank you. Ivan, any thoughts there?
I'm just going to stick with my sort of time of action theme and say this is a time, if you haven't done those courses, sure, go and enroll for them, but also this is a time to learn by doing. And there's a lot to be said for just jumping in and doing this. Everything has to be done for first time at an institution, and those are great moments of learning. And as Jen noted, you sort of take the learning in, you know, kind of appropriate size, bite-sized chunks, and you start with the easier things before you go to the harder things. But this is when we should all be learning by doing.
Thank you. And Jen, any thoughts there?
I agree with everything that's been said and on some of those resources. The one thing I would say for a finance professional is there's accounting for sustainability, which you can look up online, and it's geared at finance professionals who want to be getting involved in this and how the finance and accounting industry can help drive the sustainability agenda. So that would be the other piece I would say, but completely echo Ivan's thoughts of learn by doing. Just start getting involved, joining webinars. It's a great way to learn as well.
Thank you. And that finishes the Q&A. We'll have a few closing words and then turn to Ramona. So thanks to the panelists. And the global financial system that we're all part of and we're customers of, largely, there's progress, but still a huge amount more to do. And these initiatives and responding to them in a credible way, doing your groundwork is really important, but recognizing scale and pace is really needed, and also collaboration. And just to mention briefly, us as individuals, where we have banking relationships or pension schemes and so on, we also have a role too. We can ask our banks and those financial organizations we deal with what they're doing in this area. And we can also choose very frequently where we choose to put our money and how we choose to deal with those organizations. So I'd also encourage you to ask the question and see how your bank's dealing with this topic, or maybe how your pension scheme is invested in an ESG way or not. So I do think there's some responsibility for us as individuals there to make this change happen and to make that pace and scale real. And with that, I'll turn to Ramona. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and also thank you everyone else. Before we come to really final words, I'd like to point you towards a few upcoming events, 2 of them tomorrow. One will be focusing on carbon markets and carbon pricing in Latin America. And the second one will be about the path to net zero. So a topic that has come up today also quite a lot. And the last one is a little bit of a sneak peek about another sustainable finance event we have planned on the skills and tools your team needs, and we'll be announcing more shortly. So keep your eyes peeled. And then I would like to finally thank all of our experts and speakers for their time and insights today, and also to all of you who joined and shared your thoughts on this incredibly important debate. And if you have more questions, please reach out to us. And with that, I wish you all a nice morning, rest of the afternoon or evening. And I hope to see you soon at one of our climate chatters or somewhere else virtually. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.